Usually I make these videos the day that the patch notes come out, however I was a little busy so it's going to be slightly delayed. However, it doesn't really matter because this still will be coming out prior to the patch coming out. But we finally got the patch notes for Splatoon 2 version 1.4, and the intent for this patch was to address main weapons. However, because the overabundance of use for baller has appeared between 1.3 and now, they have decided to address more than just the main weapons. So we've got some changes to abilities, sub-weapons, and even specials in this. So without further ado, let's go into main weapon changes. First on the list is the Splash-O-Matic, which has a range increase by 6%, and the coverage done by the bullets has also increased. I feel like this isn't really too much to address anything more as it is to increase, to continuously debuff the Splash to hopefully get more people to use it. It's actually a really fun weapon, and I think the Splash only really suffers from the fact that Toxic Mist, I feel, needs to be adjusted because it consumes too much ink and has too much recovery lag. Other than that, I think the Splash would be pretty fun to play. The 52 gal received some changes to its fall-off damage. This may seem kind of confusing because when these translated patch notes came out, some people thought this meant its actual damage, but no, it's referring to its fall-off damage. So basically what it means is its fall-off damage will now do more at its furthest distance. So basically, the closer you are to a 52 gal, it's going to do the 52 damage per shot. But the farther away you are, and like if you're at its max range, it's going to do less than 52 damage. Every weapon has this sort of fall off. They basically increase the damage of the 52's fall off. The 52 gal is a weapon I've been using a lot recently. I actually started playing it prior to the baller buff. I actually thought the 52 was pretty fun. I actually liked using point sensors. This really isn't going to change too much. It actually just means that fall off damage isn't going to be as punishing as it would be before, even though I still don't really think that its fall off was even that bad to begin with. It was kind of bad in the first game. A fall off damage from a 52 was either like a 4-shot or a 5-shot, but in this one it's either a 3-shot or a 4-shot, so its fall off damage isn't as bad as it used to be, but now it's going to even be better, so it's probably just going to still remain a consistent 3 damage or 3 shot from fall off. Next up is the NZAP, which has been changed to an internal light class weapon, which basically means that it has a free main of swim speed and has a faster base mobility. It also has an increase to its firing speed by 5%, and it now will have a better job at covering its feet when it's firing. Don't really care too much for NZAP, but this seems pretty good. I think all weapons should have a better job at painting the player's feet, because that's a very important thing. I hate having to constantly look down and shoot at my feet if I'm trying to escape or something. If I'm standing in spot firing, it should be covered already, but that's just a nitpick. Next up is the Pro, which received a decent amount of changes actually. Its bullet velocity has been increased by 67%, which basically means the bullets are going to travel faster than they have before. The deviation when on the ground has been reduced by 10%, making it more accurate. Its jumping deviation has been reduced by 40%, meaning when you're jumping and firing, it's still going to be pretty accurate. Movement speed while firing has increased by 10%, and its coverage when firing has been increased by 2%. This is a sort of a big deal because the Pro is already a relatively decent, it has relatively decent accuracy, and it only really gets punished at like the farthest points in its range. But these changes will basically make it toward just, I guess at any point in the Pro's range, it's still going to be very accurate. And this is like something like a jet squelcher, which pretty much will always be dead on. And the only point of a jet squelcher that is inaccurate is like the very, very, very far end of its range. That is the only point where it's like slightly inaccurate. But this will put the Pro at that sort of range when it comes to like accuracy, and there's less deviation. Deviation basically just means that it goes away from the reticle if you are unaware of what that is. Then we have the 96 gal, which has a damage increase from 52 to 62, which puts it back at what the damage used to be back in Splatoon 1 in the early days. If you didn't play Splatoon 1 way back in the day, the 96 gal used to do 62 damage, however got nerfed down to 52 damage because people, I guess Nintendo realized that 62 damage meant that no matter how much defense up you ran in the first game, the 96 was still going to be a two-shot. But because there is no defense up now, there's little reason to like not have it have that much damage. So it's going back up to 62 damage, which is alright. I don't really mind. It's still a two-shot weapon. It also has less deviation when on the ground. It's decreased by 8%, and its jump shot deviation has also been reduced by 14%. Now we're on to the H3 nozzle nose, which has its bullet velocity increased by 25%, so its shots will travel faster. And then sort of a weird twist thing here is there is a slight point in which when you're firing, when jumping with the H3, that you're going to have less or more deviation in the shots. They've increased the time where you're going to have less deviation, so you can still jump and still have relatively decent accuracy when firing. And now they've made it to where when you fire with the H3, your feet will be covered. I don't know how important the changes to H3 are, because I don't really use the weapon, I never cared to play it, but I've heard some people complain about the deviation when you jump, but the thing is, every weapon suffers from that sort of deviation. I guess what makes it more apparent is the fact that the H3 is kind of slow, and only fires those 3 bullets, so it might be a bigger deal for people that do use H3 that deviation exists. So this is that's that for you. If you're an H3 player and you don't like that deviation, well, now you have more time to avoid having it. Then we have the Clash Blaster, which has the explosion radius increased by 14%, so its blasts will now be bigger, and the coverage from said blast has also been increased, though a percentage or any information regarding that has not been specified. So we don't know how big the blast is going to be, or I guess how much it's going to cover, but giving it a better blast, or a bigger blast, is a good step because this weapon is really fun to play. It's probably one of the most fun weapons in my opinion. However, it does kind of suffer from the fact that it doesn't really do much other than just poke people. So this will hopefully make it a little bit better at just doing things rather than just poking people. But I don't know, we'll have to see. I'll have to try it myself when this patch drops. We got stuff for the carbon roller here, and that's it reduced the amount of time needed to reach maximum speed when rolling. It's now lowered by 1 second. So basically when you're rolling around on the ground and you're covering either unturfed ink or enemy ink, as a roller you will speed up eventually. They made it so the carbon will speed up faster than it did before. And then now when you horizontal flick with the carbon, more paint will be applied closer to you. And now the damage to baller has been increased by 40%. This will become a trend here as we go forward, as a lot of weapons have had their damage to baller increased. Onto Splat Roller, we have an adjustment to the width of the coverage when at maximum roll speed. It's been increased by 8%, so when you're running at full speed, you will actually cover more of the ground. And now the horizontal flicks will provide more ink closer to you, much like the carbon got, and then its damage to baller has also been increased by 40%. Onwards we have Dynamo, which received a very similar painting buff, where at maximum speed, its width when painting has been increased, but this time it's only done by 13%. Coverage done by the Dynamo is more consistent regardless if you are vertical flicking or horizontal flicking, and if you're looking up or down when doing it. There's this sort of weird thing where with rollers, if you're vertical flicking, I guess some people say it's better to look down because it applies more ink down to where you're looking at, and I guess that kind of makes sense, but now they've made it to where regardless if you're looking up or down, the painting is more consistent. And then it has its damage done to baller increased by 60%. It's honestly quite funny to see all these buffs to Dynamo, because I swear it feels like Nintendo has nothing, doesn't understand what buffing the Dynamo means, and they only understand what nerfing it means. The Flingza roller got quite a few changes as well. The movement speed when flicking has been increased, so now you can actually move around when you flick with the roller. Other rollers like the Splat Roller kind of have this thing where if you flick, you can still move around slightly, Not to the degree that you can with like a brush, but you can still like slightly maneuver yourself around as you flick. The Flingza roller kind of suffers from not really being able to do that. And now with horizontal flicks, more ink will be applied directly in front of you. Horizontal flicks will have more coverage by 17%, and the maximum damage applied from a horizontal flick, so its effective range essentially, has been increased by 25%. This is actually really important because despite how it looks and how it may seem, the effective range of a Flingza with a horizontal flick isn't good at all. So this is something that's kind of needed to be changed to make it worth even using. I kind of like the bomb rush on it. The splash wall is kind of weird, but if it didn't have splash wall, the kit would be alright. But it sort of suffers from the fact that it seems like it's a very gimped version of the Splat Roller and Dynamo in one package. And then its damage to Baller, much like everything else, has been increased by 40%. Then an odd change, the ink brush now will not be affected by enemy ink when rolling around. So basically, if you've ever been in a situation where you're rolling around as a brush and you clip enemy ink and you have that moment where you just like slow down or come to a crawl or just stop, apparently that won't happen for ink brush anymore. So you can't just like get clipped by a small amount of enemy ink and then come to a stop. It's sort of a thing where, because the characters in the game are right-handed, you're less likely to be stopped by enemy ink if you move in a certain way than you are in another way. And now I guess it makes it to where if you're rolling around with an ink brush, the clipping an enemy ink when turning or something like that will not actually affect you anymore. And then the damage to Baller has been increased by 40%, but only when flicking, so rolling into them isn't going to have increased damage. Then continuing its trend of never being nerfed, the Octobrush returns with an increased damage to Baller by 40% once again, only by flicking, so you can't go squishing a Baller. Squiver had its damage to Baller increased by 30%. The Splat Charger and Firefin and their scoped variants have also had their damage against Baller increased by 30%. Like I said, this is a running trend with this patch. E-Liter got a buff to its coverage when firing at walls, so if you're trying to climb up a wall and you fire, it's gonna... In the first game it had a very thin line of ink when you would fire, if it wasn't a full charge. Now they've increased the amount of coverage when firing at walls by 33%, and once again, its damage to Baller has been increased by 30%. And here's one. This was actually announced before the weapon even came out. The Bamboozler will actually be getting buffed in the next patch as well. Its movement speed while charging has been increased by 50%, and its damage to Baller has been increased by 30%. So basically, it'll have a higher mobility speed while charging, which to some that don't use Bamboozler might not really get why you would want to have increased mobility while charging, but if I'd suggest watching some good Bamboozlers, and you will understand that holding a charge with that is not something you're going to do, and constantly moving is what you will be doing. So this is a really good thing, and I can't wait to see what this will result in. I'm not really someone that uses Bamboozler myself, but a teammate of mine and a good friend of mine both use it, and are both considered very good players with it. So I'm pretty sure they're happy to see this. Then, the weapon that's often considered to be one of the lowest tier weapons in the game got buffed, unsurprisingly. The Gootuber can now hold a charge at any point, so it doesn't need to be at a full charge to hold the charge anymore. So you can just like lightly charge and then start swimming around with it. So you don't need to be at a full charge to be able to hold it anymore, which is good. And it kind of just blends with the fact that the whole point of the Gootuber was that it can hold a charge for seemingly forever. The firing delay when coming out of the charge hold has been reduced by a few frames, so basically when you come out of holding the charge you will fire it faster. And then the maximum damage from a full charge has been increased from 160 to 180, which makes it to where a full charge from a Gootuber does the same damage as a full charge from an E-Liter. And then its damage against Baller also increased by, you guessed it, 30%. Now here's something I'm really excited about. The mini Splatling got a few buffs as well. Its damage will be increased from 28 to 32 per shot, which is a decent change. It's actually going to make it easier for it to pick off certain people and make it easier for a charge and a burst bomb combo to land and get kills. And then movement speed while charging has been increased by 17%, and movement speed while firing has increased by 14%. And these are actually really big things because I feel like the Mini was kind of stripped of its mobility when it came to the transition. Run speed was a must on the weapon in the first game, and now it just kind of seems not really that worth using. In fact, I was actually planning, this weekend's video was supposed to be a video where I was going to talk about my views on using run speed on the Mini and why I don't do it anymore. But it seems like this might make me consider using run speed, and we'll get back to that later because it does come up again. But I'll have to wait on that, so I'll have to see how this works out. Really excited to see this because Mini is one of my most used weapon in this game, and it's something I really love playing. The end lag after dashing with the Dapple Dualies has been decreased by a few frames. It's also been affected to the Splat Dualies, so the Amperias and the normal Dualies have also had their end lag after dashing decreased by a few frames. The Dualie Squelchers has had their radius of paint, so their coverage, increased by 9% when firing, and then the end lag after dashing has been decreased by a few frames. And then interestingly, the Dualie Squelcher, which seems to be exclusive to them, will now allow you to dash and sit in that turret stance, and then allow you to move for a slight period of time while still having the turret-like fire rate. So basically you can sit there and have that, like, you know, the accuracy when you're in your turret form, and then move around a little bit and then eventually lose it as you move around. This is actually really interesting. I like to see how much this would actually come up because I don't really see Dualie Squelchers in the first place anyway, so I can't really say if this would be a big change. The Splatbrella received quite a few buffs as well. It has made it so it's faster to pull out the Brella, so to form the shield, and then it reduced the amount of time it takes for the shield to actually appear as well. So it'll actually, like, the shield part of the Brella will come up faster than it has moved, or it did before. And then movement speed while the shield has been deployed has been increased by 38%, so you can actually move a little bit faster as you're holding the shield up. And then the maximum damage from a single pellet has been increased from 15 damage to 18 damage. So basically when a Brella fires, it has like all of those little tiny blobs of ink. A single one did 15 damage, now they'll do 18 damage. However, this does not affect its close range damage. With every shot overlapping one another, it would do 90 damage. It's still going to do 90 damage, even though the damage of a single shot has been increased. And then it has a damage against the shield has been reduced by 30% for Splatlings and Dualies. And then it'll no longer break upon contact with an active baller, which is something that I actually didn't know about until just the other day. And then damage against baller has been increased by 30% as well. The Tenebrella also got a few changes as well. The recovery time between firing speed and returning to normal movement has been reduced by 1/10 of a second. And then the minimum damage from a single pellet has been increased from 15 to 17.5. And then the maximum damage from a single shotgun blast has been increased from 120 to 122.5. So basically the close range shot has got increased by a slight amount of damage. And then the damage done against the shield has been from Splatlings and Dualies has also been reduced. The Brella will no longer break against a baller, and the damage from the Brella against ballers has also been increased by 30%. And then something I don't think anyone ever thought would happen: the arrow sprays actually got nerfed. So the radius of painting from the bullets directly hitting the ground has been reduced by 10%. The coverage from the droplets falling off the bullets has been reduced by 8%. And the frequency of the droplets falling from the bullets has been reduced by 13%. I quite honestly don't feel like arrow spray really needed to be nerfed, because no one's playing arrow spray for the arrow spray. People are playing it for the baller. If they wanted to address arrow spray being used for nothing but baller, they should be addressing baller itself. Nerfing the weapon doesn't really do anything, because it's not really no one's playing it for the weapon, so there's no point in nerfing the weapon. And then the sloshing machine had its coverage when hitting the ground at the final peak of the actual end part of the sloshing machine's fire has been reduced by 20%. So its end coverage has been reduced slightly. Now we're finally done with changes to the main weapons. Let's move on to some ability changes. Using Inksaber Main will now have a more noticeable effect on the Splattershot Pro, Luna Blaster, H3, Dynamo, E-Liter, and Tenebrella. So even if you use a slight amount of Inksaber Main, it's going to have a more noticeable effect on those weapons. Run Speed Up has its effect on Splatlings increased by 20%. So, and this is for when it's firing. This is something it needed to do, and like I mentioned earlier with the mini Splatling, this is a change that might actually make me go back to using run speed, though it is only 20%, and 20% of a low number is still a low number, so it's hard to say how much of a change this will really bring, and if it'll really make me even consider running run speed on it again. Special Power Up received a few buffs itself. When used with 10 missiles, the enlarging of the reticle has been increased by 67%. This is something that doesn't really, I mean, it kind of changes some things, but in all honesty, it still means that having one main of this will probably be the most ideal. Having one main of Special Power Up for missiles basically makes the reticle big enough to really, that's where you should stop. You really shouldn't be using more than one main on it, but now it's basically just in reassuring the fact that one main is probably all you're really going to need for it. And then using Special Power Up with Ink Armor will now reduce the wind-up time for activating the armor. So if you've ever seen that time where you use the Ink Armor and your Inkling stands up and then emits the armor, if you use Special Power Up, it'll reduce that time. So you'll spend less time standing there looking like an idiot. And then now, using Special Power Up on Inkjet will increase the explosion radius on indirect shots. So it'll make it to where the coverage from indirects will be increased. However, using Special Power Up will not give you as much time in the Inkjet as it would before. Special Power Up on Baller will now increase the radius for the 55 damage hitbox, so not its lethal hitbox, just the point where it will do 55 damage. The effects of Quick Super Jump will become more noticeable even when using small amounts. Similar to what was done with Inksaber Main, now just running a small amount of Quick Super Jump will have a more noticeable effect than before. We got some changes to Sub Power Up. Now with Ink Mines, it'll increase the duration in which the player is marked when the Ink Mine will mark them. For sprinklers, it'll increase the time with the high point of the sprinklers, so the fast point where the sprinkler is covering at a high speed, that has been increased by 150%. For point sensors, using Sub Power Up will now increase the duration at which the point sensor is active, and then using Sub Power Up on squid beacons will now have a 50% more improvement to the jump time. For those that don't actually know, if you use Sub Power Up for beacons, it makes it to where if you jump to the beacon, it actually moves faster than it would before. So it basically applies Quick Super Jump to you when you're jumping to that beacon. Now it'll apply 50% more time to that. Cold Blooded had its effect increased by 20%, so you'll spend less time when you're marked. And now Cold Blooded will affect the distance at which Haunt, Thermal Ink, and the Stingray Vision will be able to see you. Opening Gambit will now include Ink Res effects. Last Ditch Effort will now apply a few more subs of each ability. So basically before, how it would be is Last Ditch Effort would kind of give you like a main of every sort of effect that it has. Now it'll give you like a main and like 4 subs or something like that. Thermal Ink now has a decreased minimum range at which an opponent needs to be away from you to be seen through a wall. This is actually something that I didn't know how it worked until a couple weeks ago, where the Thermal Ink is actually based on distance away from you. And they had to be a certain distance away for them to be visible through a wall. And I actually found through testing that the first weapon that has enough range to hit and then get the effects were the H3 Nozzle Nose. So anything that outranges H3 will benefit from thermal ink, and anything that has less range than H3 did not benefit from having thermal ink. Respawn Punisher got a few changes as well. It now has increased the special loss of an opponent that you kill from 5% to 15%, so they're going to lose more special when you kill them wearing Respawn Punisher. But the trade-off is, if you die, your special loss has been increased from 7.5% to 22.5%. Drop Roller will now allow you to roll in any direction upon landing. Basically, if you didn't know, Drop Roller kinda restricted you to 4 directions when you landed. Now you can hold any direction and you'll roll in that direction. And the end lag on Drop Roller has been removed completely. So when you land, roll, you can instantly move out of it, where before it would be sort of the similar way that you would dash with a dually, where you have that slight end lag where you're like getting back up onto your feet. That will no longer exist. And now we're done with ability changes, so let's move on to the final part, changes to special weapons. 10 of missiles damage to Baller has been increased by 50%. Yes, this is even running into specials. Stingray has a buff to its distance when you see them with the sort of thermal ink-like vision. So when you're pulling out a Stingray and you get the little outline for the person, that the range at which they need to be away from you has been decreased slightly. It's sort of akin to the thermal ink, to where now they don't have to be as far away for you to be able to see them. And then the damage done to Baller by Stingray has been increased by 100%. Inkjet's damage from an indirect and a direct to Baller has also been increased by 100%. Then Curling Bomb Rush got a sort of coverage buff slightly. For those that actually don't know, because I feel like this is actually not known at all, if you hold down the sub button when you're using a Curling Bomb Rush, the curling bombs will actually travel further. So it's the quite opposite of when you use a normal curling bomb, where if you hold the button, it won't travel as far. Now, with the bomb rush, you actually want to hold it down to make it travel farther rather. And now they've made it to where if you are not holding down the button, they will still travel far, and the distance has been increased by 50%. That was a pretty prolonged explanation, but there you go. Inkstorm's damage to Baller has been increased by 150%. Your teammates will now do more damage to the bubbles from your bubble blower than the enemy will, making it easier for you and your teammates to pop them, as opposed to, doing the same amount of damage to your own team's bubbles that the opponents would do. So you will be able to pop your teammates' bubbles faster than the opponent will. Time between firing the last bubble and using your main weapon has been decreased, so you will have less time between firing the last bubble and then getting your weapon back, essentially. And then the damage done to Baller has been increased by 100%. And then some changes to Baller to end it all off. Baller now will do 150% more damage to Baller, which is kind of funny if you think about it. And the sound effect for Baller has now been made louder, so it's more obvious. And then when not using any special power-up, the explosion radius of the 55 damage hitbox has been reduced by 14%. So basically, if they aren't using any special power, you are probably going to get the very outside range of the hitbox. You're more likely to get hurt by the very end of the hitbox. And that's pretty much it. There was a lot to go over, surprisingly, as we were only told that it was going to address main weapons, but I can see why they wanted to make a lot of the changes that they did, as some of it has become annoying. I wouldn't say awful. I don't want to say that it was really bad, because I also played Splatoon 1 and I'd quite honestly still take the Baller over Kraken and Bubble. But it was some necessary changes. I've seen quite a few friends of mine just stop playing because they're sick of having to just be stomped on by Baller, because weapons don't do enough damage to break it. Even with Object Shredder, it just doesn't feel like a lot of weapons currently do enough damage to counter Baller. So it's very good that they're making a lot of the changes to where now it's going to be easier to break Baller, which may actually make it viable, or I guess more useful, to run Object Shredder to one man a Baller. So I'm actually kind of excited to see this happen. I'm quite excited to see these changes. I like the changes to like the mini Splatling. I'm excited for that to happen. And yeah, we do know that the next patch actually won't be addressing, well, I guess I shouldn't say it's not going to go over it, but it won't specifically be addressing the weapons. The next patch will actually address the game's system, and we don't know too much outside of it, but we do know that they are going to address like outside things like the rank system, hopefully, and other features like that. So it may still cover weapons, specials, and so on and so forth, but it seems that their focus is going to be addressing the outside systems. So we'll have to see. So what are your thoughts on these changes? Did something need to be changed? Did you not like the changes? Do you like the changes? I want to hear what you guys have to say. So if you made it this far, leave a comment with what you liked, what you thought was a good change, what you thought should be changed, and what you don't like that's being changed. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and I will see you all later.